Councillor Tett, Dr Wellings, thank you very much for joining us for this second session of the fourth meeting of this inquiry. I was just asking what 51M stood for. Could you...
As a marketeer by background, I'm always believing in a good brand. The reason we chose 51M is an alliance of 19 local authorities who lie along the route, who've got together in order to, first of all, initially understand the proposal and have subsequently campaigned against it and are currently now actually engaged in petitioning on it. Why it's 51M, which is, I think, the nub of your question, on the original costings, which are substantially less than the current costings, we calculated that for every parliamentary constituency in the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland and Scotland, albeit they're devolved, it would cost £51 million.
Thank you very much. Would either of you like to make an opening statement?
I wouldn't mind. Sorry, after you, Richard.
No, please.
Okay. I just wanted to make two very brief comments to you. It's often said that people who oppose HS2 are groups of tree-hugging NIMBYs who are fundamentally opposed to infrastructure projects and particularly averse to rail. I just wanted to say that as local authorities, we are well used to taking tough and often very unpopular decisions that are not always appreciated by our residents. And certainly I've had effigies of me hanging from trees around my county for some very unpopular infrastructure decisions I've had to take. But we always say that they have to be, if you're going to take these sort of decisions with taxpayers' money, you have to make sure they have a good business case, that they genuinely bring the benefits that are identified in those business cases, and that you've looked at all of the available opportunities and have done credible comparisons of those alternatives with the option you want to adopt. And as local authorities, that's the original starting point we had. We did that, and we've found HS2 consistently wanting on all three. And just on the issue of trains, again, people say, I in particular am anti-train. Let me just observe that we are currently very active promoters of and supporters of a East-West Rail scheme running initially between Oxford and Cambridge via Bedford, and I'm actually investing £15 million worth of our taxpayers' money into promoting that scheme with a link down to Aylesbury. That will have a very significant impact on the north of the county. So it's completely untrue to say that we are anti-train or indeed anti-infrastructure.
An economically rational transport investment policy would allocate scarce resources to those projects with the highest returns. Yet even if one accepts the official estimates, and in reality there are major doubts whether the benefits will actually outweigh the costs, it is clear that High Speed 2 offers poor value for money compared with alternative transport schemes. Data in support of this is available from a comprehensive study by John Dodgson, Rates of Return on Public Spending on Transport, and several other sources. The issue of opportunity cost is therefore the Achilles heel of HS2. Clearly, the vast resources required could be better deployed elsewhere. If the aim is to cut journey times, then other schemes would deliver far more valuable savings for less expenditure. If the objective is to address overcrowding, then there are far more cost-effective ways of increasing capacity and making more efficient use of existing links. And if regeneration of the north is a priority, then greater gains would come from investing in local schemes that would deliver substantial agglomeration benefits. In summary, High Speed 2 fails the test of economic logic. It is being driven by a mixture of politics and special interest pressure rather than rational economic analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we shall return to some of those issues as we go through the questions. Can I just start with capacity? There seems to be quite a divergence between a lot of the commentators in the Department for Transport. The Department for Transport argues that there is severe overcrowding. Many of the trains are only available for people who want to stand. Others say this is not the case. In fact, in the previous session we learnt that most of the trains were about half full. What's your view of capacity?
I'll just kick off on that and then Richard will come in. This is an area where there have been many twists and turns, I think, in the case generated by the Department for Transport. There have been a number of, I would say, quite frankly, let's call it misleading statements. I've seen statements that the West Coast Main Line is already full. I've seen statements that it will be full in 10 years. I've seen statements that our alternative, which I'm sure we'll discuss, couldn't possibly handle any of the growth on the West Coast Main Line. All of those are completely inaccurate. My daughter used to go to Manchester University. She's recently left, always travelled on the West Coast main line up to Manchester. I've experienced that train on many occasions. When you actually look at the reality of it, you'll find that actually the intercity capacity between London and the north on the West Coast main line is one of the least crowded lines coming out of London. The two busiest lines are actually Paddington, which is 99% load factor, and Waterloo with a 91% load factor. If you want to see really crowded trains, look at those two lines. What the government does, quite deliberately, I believe, is blur the distinction between commuter capacity and intercity capacity, and they are fundamentally different. So when it talks about these crowded trains, that is absolutely true if you're looking at commuter capacity into London. If you're coming in from places like Hemel Hempstead, Milton Keynes, Northampton, you will experience problems on those lines. But the issue at stake here is what is actually the capacity requirements on the intercity to places like Birmingham and Manchester. Now, the government repeatedly refused to release the passenger load factors on those trains. The only place we got them eventually was in the High Court, when we had to, with great reluctance, take them to judicial review, and literally in the court at the last minute they revealed those numbers. And they actually show the passenger load factors at peak periods, on for example, a Friday evening is 52%. 52%. So the problem is on the commuter lines, and you would not spend £50 billion worth of taxpayers' money to relieve commuter capacity problems into Euston. There are much quicker and cheaper ways of solving that problem. You would certainly look at the areas which are most crowded, and as I said, those are places like Paddington and Waterloo.
How would you describe the DfT's capacity analysis?
I'd like to agree with Martin in the sense that clearly the data show that this is one of the least overcrowded routes coming into and out of London, and if overcrowding was the main priority, then addressing the problems on this route were quite low down the list. And clearly compared with things like London Underground, the overcrowding is relatively trivial, so you have hundreds of thousands of people standing for quite long periods, 30, 40 minutes every morning peak. But I think that the main point I would like to make is that a lot of these problems are in a sense artificial and created by government intervention. So even now, roughly 40% of spending on the heavy rail network is funded by the taxpayer. You have price controls on the network, so the government decided not to introduce super peak pricing to try and flatten the peaks and spread the load and make better use of existing capacity. You have a particular problem on Friday night with the saver fares when there's a sudden threshold and everyone suddenly crowds onto that first train where you're allowed to use the saver fare. Also, I mean, it's widened this. The government policy since the early 90s has been distorting land use planning to force more and more development into rail corridors. Rail users also get tax breaks, so you have road users paying massive fuel duty, rail users don't even pay VAT. So it's an artificial market. Huge amounts of money have been pumped into the West Coast main line, but taxpayers paid, I don't know, maybe 90, 95% of that bill. Rail users hardly any. So this is a hugely distorted market, and really the price mechanism's not being allowed to operate to try and solve some of these problems.
Back on from what you're saying, it seems to me that you've been addressing the business case very much for HS2. As far as we've heard from and what we've read from the Department of Transport and from HS2 Limited, the business case, they started emphasising very heavily the time saved, which they monetised. But now they talk more about willingness to pay. And yet when we heard evidence last week from HS2 Limited, which is Department of Transport and another name, they said they weren't going to charge, they wouldn't charge higher fares on HS2 because if they did that, then the people wouldn't use HS2, they'd go on using the West Coast main line. That seems to me, but maybe I'm wrong, maybe you can explain, evidence that there isn't a willingness to pay for the improved service in terms of higher speeds or whatever. Can you explain that?
I can't explain that, which is part of the problem. Let's be frank, there's history here. I mean, there is completely muddled thinking on this business case. It's one of the things that we originally found out and, quite frankly, caused us as local authorities to begin to have severe doubts about the good value of spending this sort of money. When you look at the original business case, it was predicated on the assumption that people didn't work on trains. And I'm sure you've heard that already from previous witnesses. The idea that in the 21st century, no one used an iPad or a computer or had mobile phones, I mean, was completely ludicrous. And there were various Newsnight commentaries showing the Secretary of State for Transport and indeed the Prime Minister busily working on trains. So that was complete nonsense and couldn't be defended, although it was through, I think, about 5 previous versions of the business case. In the most recent version, which was, I think, October last year, they had to admit defeat on this one. But magically, what they managed to do was transform the savings that were originally, because people didn't work on trains, it simply became, quote, willingness to pay, unquote. Now, the concept behind this is absolutely identical, because fundamentally what you're saying is an employer will pay the time value for an employee to get to a journey place faster, even though they now admit that the time spent on that train is productive. Now, that's quite ludicrous. It isn't going to happen. It is quite mythical, and it is simply a way of preserving, the very vast amount of money that's generated for the business case by that assumption. It's completely ludicrous. And again, if you play in the issue of the price premium on it, that again just completely contradicts the assumptions within it. This is a desperate business case that flounders for justification.
Yes, I mean, on the business case, I thought it was bizarre that we had a significant rise in the cost of construction costs and so on during summer 2013. We also had a big fall in the time savings benefits because they started to account for business travellers working on the train. And yet the benefit cost ratio stayed almost identical, which means that either the previous cost-benefit analyses were very far wrong, or the newer one was very far wrong. And I think how they achieved that was to massively increase the forecast for the proportion of business travellers using the service. But I'm not sure on what grounds that happened and why all of a sudden there was a big change in the modelling such that there would be a massive increase in business travellers. I'd also like to add, I think there's a problem in the sense that the economies of the Midlands and the North are very dominated by state spending. And I wonder how many of these so-called business travellers are actually genuine wealth creators or rather various state functionaries and state-privileged professionals, subcontractors for the state. And the idea that there is this sort of wider economic benefit from these kind of journeys from those kind of people who aren't actually wealth creators, I think, is a problem. And I'd like to see some sort of analysis from the DfT as to the composition of those business journeys.
And finally, you think that your 51M alternative has a stronger, more robust business case, do you? And if so, could you explain very briefly why?
Well, it's not my view. It's the view of the Department for Transport and indeed the analysis they carried out. Just for comparison, at the time, I think there were 2 versions of the business case ago, the BCR for HS2 hovered around, I think it was 1.2. The same analysis for our alternative was, I think, about 5.4. And it's a very simple reason. That it's a vastly cheaper scheme. And if I just outline it very briefly, because it's incredibly straightforward. It basically utilises existing infrastructure but upgrades it in a way that's incremental. It can be done as demand materialises, or indeed it does not materialise, depending on your view of the demand forecasts. It is far cheaper. It is something that actually is very easily explainable to people. You have a situation at the moment where the configuration of the trains involve normally about 4 first-class carriages. And yet the load factor in those first-class carriages is actually very low. So if you converted 1 or 2 of those first-class carriages to standard-class carriages, you would achieve a significant increase in capacity at virtually no incremental cost. Likewise, the length of the trains is currently around 9 carriages. They could be increased to 12 carriages. Again, with the exception of Liverpool Lime Street, which has a capacity constraint on its platform, where you probably increase it to around 11. That, again, by a combination of reducing the amount of first class and increasing the length of the trains, would lead to a massive increase in terms of the actual capacity on those routes. and you could do that at virtually no incremental cost. You then, in addition, because of the commuter issue, which we touched on earlier, need to take out some of the pinch points along the line. These are capacity constraints that actually limit the number of trains that can actually pass through a particular point on the line. And there are 3 particular pinch points along the line. One near Stafford, and another major one near Ledburn Junction, just south of Milton Keynes, and the third one I always forget, which is Brinklow in Nuneaton. And if you actually take those out, then actually you can massively increase the amount of commuter capacity on those routes as well. So, pretty simple, easy steps lead to creating the volume step change that absolutely meets the 102% increase in demand that is forecast as the organic growth on that West Coast main line that is contained within the DfT's own forecasts. What it does not do, let me be quite frank, is it doesn't meet the extra growth that is generated solely because HS2 is built. So HS2 is building, it's justifying its own existence by creating its own demand. What you will do is meet all of the organic demand that is actually generated by things like population growth and so on along that line, and you will do it at a fraction of the cost in a very quicker way and a much more incremental approach than you would with High Speed 2.
Yes, Dr. Wellings, excuse me. In August 2013, you said that the estimate, or a plausible estimate, I think is the word, for this HS2 project was £80 billion. Could you like to tell me how that was, or tell us how that was broken down?
Yes. Firstly, the report points out that there are wider economic losses from the tax bill, the tax spending of HS2. These include deadweight costs, so the economic activity that's suppressed by the extra taxation needed to fund HS2. And that's really a big plus on the bill. And it's hard to pin down exactly because it depends what form of tax you're using to raise the money to pay for the scheme. But if it was income tax, generally economists estimate that would add around 33% to the overall bill. So there are these wider economic losses. You've also got things like diseconomies of agglomeration. So the fact that by increased clustering also creates costs. We don't really hear much about that. We always hear about the wider economic benefits, but not about the costs. So that's a big plus on top of the scheme. And usually the Treasury deals with that by disallowing schemes or blocking schemes that have a low benefit cost ratio. So you rarely see many schemes being built with a benefit cost ratio of around 1.4 like High Speed 2 Phase 1. That's pretty rare if you look at the long list of government transport schemes. So that's the first point. But the report is actually an analysis of the incentive structures facing policymakers. It's a public choice analysis, and that leads to 3 predictions that then lead into cost risks for the project. The first prediction is that, I should explain, it's because the basic thesis is that concentrated special interests will be able to outweigh dispersed interests. So concentrated interests like the train manufacturers, the local authorities and so on will be able to have disproportionate influence over the political process compared with the big losers, which are taxpayers, and also concentrated losers, the people on the route, will have disproportionate influence compared with dispersed losers like taxpayers. That's the theory. So the first prediction is that there'll be more, because of these interest group pressure, there'll be a lot more route change than tunnelling along the route, as we've seen already, and that will increase costs. That's relatively minor, but it's a massive cost risk. The second one is that local authorities will be successful in lobbying the government for very expensive regeneration projects along the route around the HS2 stations. And as we saw with HS1 at King's Cross, Stratford, Ebbsfleet and so on. And that's potentially hugely expensive. And this will create these sort of Potemkin villages full of public sector workers that we see in Salford Quays, and we're going to see it at Stratford City as well, rather than, in most cases, not actually genuine wealth creation. It's all about the politics to create the illusion that HS2 has delivered all these benefits, so you build these shiny offices around the stations. But the largest single off-balance sheet cost is the links to the HS2 stations that will have to be built. So this is partly because local authorities and regional transport bureaucracies, etc., will use HS2 to successfully lobby central government for funding for the schemes that link into HS2 rather than much better value schemes elsewhere, or the alternative of cutting taxes. And this is potentially a huge cost. It's also because HS2 creates problems in particular locations, including Euston, which is already the most overcrowded part of the tube network. So TfL will then use HS2 as a way of lobbying for Crossrail 2. OK, it's an old scheme, don't include the whole cost, but I think you have to include the cost of diverting the route to Euston, for example, or trams that will go specifically to HS2 stations. So there are massive off-balance sheet costs from HS2. Probably just the transport links alone, I would estimate in the order of 12 to 15 billion.
Thank you. Did the subsequent economic case that was published after your report, has that changed your view at all?
No, I mean, I think the report's been vindicated because we've already seen extra tunnelling announced in the Midlands. So that's and massive lobbying for extra tunnelling in the Chilterns as well. We've seen more details of these huge regeneration schemes at Old Oak Common, Manchester, Birmingham and so on. They're going to be hugely expensive for the taxpayer. And we've also seen various, it's getting more likely that these various transport links are going to be built as well. To be honest, most of those plans are already in the public domain. It's just they're not heavily publicised. But the main thing is the government now talks openly about these extra costs. It calls them making cities HS2 ready. So what I'd like to see is for the government to come clean about how much making cities HS2 ready is going to cost.
Thank you. Do you have anything you want to
I would say clearly I approach it from a slightly different perspective, but I completely agree. I mean, if you just want a case study, you look at what's happening in the West Midlands with Centro. I mean, they are already, and have been now for well over a year, lobbying in terms of the incremental costs that were required to interconnect into HS2. Increasingly, it's called realising the benefits of HS2. If you just substitute realising the benefits for additional costs because of, then you've actually got the reality behind it. And if you look at some of the other obvious examples where, in Sheffield you're going into Meadowhall rather than into the city centre, you're going to have to connect the two in some way. That, again, is an incremental cost.
Yes, one of the justifications for HS2 is clearly the future demand for rail travel, the demand forecasts that are coming forward. We have evidence from Professor Venables, to name but one, saying that he didn't find the Department of Transport's estimates for demand forecasts to be unreasonable. Do you think they're unreasonable? And if they are reasonable, why do you think they're reasonable?
I didn't hear Professor Venables' evidence, so I can't comment on the context in which he said that. But if you look at the examples of the sort of forecast growth that the DFT have given, I mean, it's 5 times faster than population growth. And I heard the question about population growth as I came in belatedly. I mean, the experience, let's just look at the track record. Experience from HS1 shows that all the demand forecasts on HS1 were massively, massively over-optimistic. They haven't been realised whatsoever. And I heard the gentleman who was in just before me giving me some numbers on that. So there is always a tendency, and we've all written business cases in previous business lives, you inflate the demand to get the numbers to add up. So let's start with the track record on that. Assumptions on pricing. Again, you have to really factor those in. What is going to be your pricing assumption? Are you going to premium price? Or are you going to try and skim the market with a high price? Or are you actually going to go for market penetration with a low price? And if you do that, you're in direct competition with the existing lines that are there. You have to factor in a realistic assumption on pricing. I don't believe they've done that, and I think you've clearly identified that from your previous questioning. There is little or no assumption about the growth of new technology in this. If you just think back 10 years to what's happened in the last 10 years in technology, I mean, the iPad didn't exist 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. Just think what it's going to be like by the time this train opens in 2025, 26, or is completed in 2033, 34. The world will be radically different then. So when you look at that and the fact that, for example, in the past, the big step change that happened in demand historically was when the West Coast Main Line was modernised. And that absolutely reduced the time of the journey and destroyed the comparative advantage of air travel for domestic flights. That air travel has by and large now gone. It does not exist any longer for domestic capacity. So therefore there is no longer any step change that's going to result from a similar improvement. So I think if you add all of those factors, and many others I could go into, I think the demand forecasts have to be seriously questioned.
Yes, I'd agree. I mean, clearly, the possible impact of disruptive technology is an enormous risk. So things like, things we can't even imagine, but things like improved teleworking and remote meetings, even driverless cars, which would be much more convenient for a lot of business travellers, because of course HS2 will still be a 3-stage journey, and which would be pretty long. You're looking probably getting on for 3 hours for a typical person who lives in a Manchester suburb and is commuting into the City of London. It's a 3-stage journey, so a lot of journeys will be potential competition from driverless cars. But I think there's another issue that Lord Lawson mentioned earlier, which is how will HS2 deal with competition from the existing West Coast main line. And remember, in Birmingham, the existing West Coast main line actually goes into New Street Station, which is far more convenient for people coming in from Wolverhampton or Dudley or wherever. And it means they don't have to take a 10-minute tram ride or walk to the Curzon Street Station. So providing the government allows fair competition, then clearly that could really eat into the HS2 revenues, particularly as people find it easy now to work on trains. So that extra bit of time that it takes on the existing West Coast main line could actually be quite useful for business travellers, because they've set at their laptop or whatever. But what happened in Holland, of course, is that the market was rigged deliberately to try and force passengers onto the high-speed line. And I can see something similar happening in the UK. So they would deliberately slow down the existing West Coast main line to try and make it stop at every station to try and force people to use high-speed too. And when you've got an artificial market like this, I think that's highly likely. Finally, there's clearly a political risk that given that we could be looking at a sort of Japan-style long-term stagnation with very low economic growth for the next 10 or 20 years, which I think is very likely. Given that, the appetite for continuing the current high level of rail subsidies could decline markedly, and that could have a particular impact on some of the feeder routes into HS2 that are hugely subsidised, and that could then cut passenger numbers quite significantly.
Just quickly, if I could, is there any evidence that digital technology for using a shorthand for basically people using their laptops and iPads and what have you, that's actually reduced demand for transport? I know anecdotally
there have been studies actually by the DFT that have shown similar trends. Do I personally have that at my fingertips? No, I don't, but I'm sure we can find something. But if I could just ask, an appeal to common sense would tell you if you've travelled on a train, it's some of the most valuable time that you actually have in terms of, even historically, being able to read reports, write work, and so on. The advent of mobile technology and wireless technology makes that time extremely productive now. You're normally away from a lot of distractions, and actually you can work very productively, and you can send and receive emails and reports. Just common sense tells you how productive that is. May I make one quick point? I just wanted to reinforce something, and maybe you covered this earlier, and I apologise if you have, but HS2 always talks about city centre to city centre connectivity and time savings. The reality, and I lived in Manchester for 4 years, is the people who travel don't live in the city centre of Manchester. I live in Buckinghamshire. If I want to get to Birmingham, I go to High Wycombe. If I want to get to Manchester, I go to Watford. I don't spend an hour travelling into Euston to wait and then catch a train. And most of those journey time savings that they predicate so much of the demand on actually are completely nullified when you look at where people actually live and want to get to.
I'd just like to ask Dr Wellings 2 questions, which I didn't fully understand of things that you've said so far. You referred to regional transport bodies which are charged with local and sub-regional transport management and often investment. You referred to them as regional transport bureaucracies, and I wondered why you used the word bureaucracies. And secondly, you asserted, in answer to an earlier question, that a lot of business travel is generated by the state, not by the private sector. And I'd just like to know what your evidence base for that statement is.
Well, if you remember, I said this is something that the DFT should be looking into and trying to work out the composition of business travellers. But my reasoning for that is because if you look at the economies of the Midlands and the North West, for example, they're heavily dominated by the state sector. So on some measures, around, say, 55 to 60% of regional GDP is government spending in those areas. There's relatively little genuine wealth creation going on. There's government money going in and then being circulated, so benefits money, public sector workers, and then them spending that money in the private sector. So That's what I'm saying. If you look at some of these look at Salford Keys, you've got massive offices for HMRC and the BBC, these kind of people. So I do worry, given the pervasive nature of state intervention, that a lot of these so-called business travellers won't actually be wealth creators. They'll be government workers and so forth, state privileged professionals, in the legal profession, subcontractors for the government and so on. Just because of the nature of the economy in the Midlands and the North West, where, as I said, the regional GDP is completely dominated by government spending.
I don't want to pursue the point now because, but it might be helpful, Dr. Wellings, if we had a note which just explained your view about wealth creation anywhere in the north of England or perhaps further north. So can you then just, why do you call them bureaucracies as opposed to regional transport bodies, which is what they actually are?
Well, they're also bureaucracies, though, just with semantics, really, isn't it? I mean, if you look at TfL, that's a classic example where they've seen a massive increase in staffing levels, and particularly those on very high salaries, more and more sort of increase in their sort of a power grab in terms of their responsibilities, which we've also seen in the Midlands and the North and so on. I'm generally against these organisations because I think it leads to jam spreading where the central government feels it has to dole out a certain amount of money to each of these organisations, even though that passive investment is likely to be seriously suboptimal because it won't reflect the optimising the economic returns.
I could say I have a slightly different perspective, obviously, to Dr. Wellings on the benefits or otherwise of the public sector. But what I would hope you'd look at is actually the dramatic increase in the percentage of business travellers, whoever they may be, public or private sector, in the latest business case, which has gone from 28 to 38%. And I can find no evidence whatsoever that supports that dramatic increase, although it does magically rebalance the business case.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was helpful. But Councillor Tett, just ask you now a very specific question, because you've only once, in fact, both of you have only once ever mentioned anywhere north of Manchester in my memory today, which is when you talked about air connectivity. Okay, but there is an argument for saying that capacity would rise and people would come away from air, because there are lots of air links to London, in fact, from places like Glasgow. There are a lot of people who are driving cars. They may transfer to train. There are people who use coach. It is possible that they would use train. The point is that although the high-speed track, ends at Manchester, the rolling stock continues north to Glasgow. Okay? So actually the benefits in some of the saving of time for people who live in Strathclyde, for example, is actually going to be potentially significant, and it may encourage people to move from their current mode of travel onto high-speed rail. Now, have either of you given that any consideration?
The answer is I have. Let me try and address that, and I'm sure Richard will have a view as well. First of all, I think I've mentioned north of Watford a couple of times because, not only was my daughter at university there, but I was at university there, and I also lived there for 4 years, so I know Manchester incredibly well. And I also mentioned about getting to Birmingham by train. So I absolutely understand the geography of the UK and the importance of the regional diversity of the UK, and indeed regenerating the regions of the UK, which I also attribute very high importance to. When you look at the connectivity, I mean, what you're talking about is by 2033, the track to Manchester in theory will be complete if one believes that public sector projects are complete on time and on budget. Then you transfer to the classic network up to Scotland. So the time savings obviously diminish as you get onto the classic network. It's only when you get to Scotland and indeed achieve dramatic time savings that actually transfer from air to rail starts to actually kick in. So you're looking at a very significant period of time ahead. If you look at the DfT's own forecasts within their own business case, the amount of traffic that transfers from road to HS2 is absolutely minimal. I seem to remember it's 3%, because the actual, I think it's 95% of traffic currently travels by road. And the opportunity to divert that onto rail, even on the DfT's own analysis, is absolutely minuscule. So although I laud the aspiration of moving people en bloc from road to rail, the reality is that isn't going to happen. There's no evidence it would happen. The DfT itself cannot generate evidence that would happen. And as far as air is concerned, within the UK, within England, there is very little left. There would be some from Scotland, admittedly, but you'd have to wait a very long time to actually see that.
So in broad terms, you think that the estimates of the benefits about what businesses are willing to pay for quicker journeys, broadly speaking, has not been met, although it might from Scotland in the longer term. Have I interpreted what you're saying correctly?
I would, let me rephrase that slightly. As far as business is concerned, I think there are two concerns. One is I do not believe for a second the willingness to pay calculation. I think it's completely fictional and is calculated to hide a hole in the business case. Secondly, I don't believe the percentage of business people that is now being calculated to travel on this train, and it hides a second hole in the business case, and they're completely artificial constructs. As far as transfer is concerned, I believe there would be some willingness of people to move potentially from conventional classic rail or air onto high-speed rail once it reaches places like Glasgow and Edinburgh. But the volumes of those would be very small compared to the total growth forecast by HS2.
Okay, thank you.
Gentlemen, come back to premium prices. If the operator was able to charge premium fares on HS2, what effect do you think it would have on passenger demand?
Well, if I could start, yes. I think that comes back to my point about what happens to the existing West Coast main line. Because if genuine competition were allowed, then clearly that would put a limit on how much premium fares could be charged on HS2, because it would just push people onto the existing West Coast main line, particularly given often the stations are far more convenient and there are more of them on the West Coast main line. Let's not forget that in the North and Midlands you don't have these sort of gentrified inner city areas. Generally, professional people tend to live quite a long way out of the city centre. So I think that's a crucial question. But as I mentioned earlier, I suspect that the market will be rigged by the government through the franchising process to deliberately slow down the existing West Coast main line in order to stifle any competition and perhaps allow the charging of premium fares.
It follows then that you are concerned about the extent to which HS2 is reliant on public subsidy, whether premium rates are charged or not.
Well, yes, it's, from a commercial point of view, it's completely loss-making, and private investors would never go near it at all. It's completely government subsidised. Whether or not it can actually cover its operating costs, I think, is an interesting question. It will depend on the passenger numbers. But if we look at HS1, Eurostar had to be bailed out by the taxpayer, and then the market was then rigged by the government so that the track access charges were pushed onto a greater share of them was pushed onto the local Kent services, which were heavily subsidised by the DfT. So, if you like, a backdoor way of subsidising Eurostar.
Maybe I could just add to that very briefly, which is, I think we discussed earlier, I think it was Lord Lawson who questioned the whole pricing demand equation. They don't make sense. I mean, there's a complete contradiction between the premium pricing and the volume demands that are in the business case. If one just accepts that, the other key point, which I would completely agree with Dr. Wellings on, is the opportunity cost issue. Even if you accepted their numbers, which are clearly nonsensical, the fact that you are subsidising this system to such a large extent means that there is an opportunity cost year on year of that money could otherwise be spent on. And when you look at where the real constraints are around this country, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, you look at the issue of skill shortages, particularly in the Midlands and the north of England, you could be spending that money on upgrading the skills of our young people and our blue-collar employees around the country to give a real competitive advantage to our regions. And that is a foregone opportunity because that public subsidy is there.
Last week, Professor Overman told us that the wider economic benefits using the methods that the department uses had been carefully constructed, which I must say I find a rather delightfully ambiguous way of expressing it. And he came up with the estimate that the overall benefit of this kind is 13.3 billion. Now, I don't wish to be unduly unkind, but I'm a theoretical physicist, and that's how I was trained. And when somebody purports this sort of stuff to do something that they will give me 3-digit precision, I wonder. So I realise I am leading here, but it was the question that happened to fall to me, and that's Professor Overman's bad luck. So may I ask you what you think of this?
Well, I come from a marketing and business background, and I was taught by a sales colleague once that if you want to give spurious credibility to anything, always quote it to 2 decimal places. So I would offer that as a context. I'm surprised because last year Professor Overman, when he was actually talking to the Transport Select Committee, actually said that he thought the KPMG study on which a lot of this is based actually was overstated by between 6 and 8 times. So, you know, there is massive lack of credibility in a lot of the underpinning wider economic benefit assumptions that go into this. Most of the methodology is widely discredited. Even KPMG themselves heavily caveated their work. And most of the negative impacts that HS2 will generate were actually omitted from any of the public released information. So it was a completely distorted picture. And one has to recognise that although there may be somewhat wider economic benefits, which are not normally quoted, by the way, in DFT benefit cost ratios, they've had to be in these cases, there are also negative wider economic benefits, because if you agglomerate around an HS2 station, the likelihood is that you'll be sucking in those businesses from other surrounding areas. So, for example, take Manchester, which again I know well. You know, if you build around Piccadilly Station because suddenly that becomes a high-rent area because there's an HS2 station there, is that actually generating business that would otherwise be in London? I think not. It's almost certainly going to take business that would otherwise be in places like Bolton or Oldham, Rochdale, or around the centre of the satellite towns. So I think that the wider economic benefits, I think, have to be treated, as I'm sure any scientist would do, with a large block of salt.
Well, in my own position, as I guess I sketched earlier, was that broadly having better rail system is a benefit, and I wonder whether you think what you think. I guess you've just sketched it. You don't think there are wider economic benefits? Because although I don't believe the calculations, I do believe there are wider benefits.
I think what I said was there are some, but there are also negatives. So clearly, you know, if you build a railway station, let's say in Crewe or in Manchester Piccadilly, you will have some economic benefits because of that. And that's clearly true. If you spend a large amount of money on anything, you will generate jobs. Whether they are wealth-creating jobs is another question entirely. Whether they are sustainable jobs into the long term is a questionable assumption. You know, you will increase property prices around where there is new development. That's clearly true. So there are a number of wider economic impacts of that. What I'm saying is that there are also negative wider economic impacts, which are then not mentioned in most of the analyses that you see before you. You know, these are the issues where you suck in skills and resources into unproductive sectors of the economy, which could otherwise be deployed in more productive sectors of the economy, and indeed suck in capital to property speculation that would be better employed, for example, in factory production or whatever elsewhere. So there are negative consequences as well as potentially some wider economic benefits.
Could I just add that agglomeration benefits are subject to quite steep distance decay. So if you wanted to maximise those benefits, you would tend to focus on local transport schemes rather than something like HS2. For example, if you look at labour markets, you want schemes that can integrate labour markets and get people into commuting distance of a particular hub and cluster of activity, and clearly that would tend to be local schemes rather than long-distance schemes. Also, these agglomeration benefits are vulnerable to technological change, so increasingly businesses will interact online and in virtual clusters, and that's where you'll get these ideas coming off, and don't necessarily have to meet face-to-face. And also there's an issue of sectoral change, so some sectors like professional services tend to benefit quite a lot from increased connectivity, but other sectors like manufacturing benefit a lot less. So if the sectoral composition of the economy changed, then those wider economic benefits would also change enormously. So there's a problem of predicting 20, 30 years ahead.
Well, Monks.
HS2 is a long-term project, and it's 10 years away from ever running any trains if it goes ahead.
And the objective of taking a long-term view of the economy and the need to rebalance it, which I think both of you have accepted, even if there's a slight difference perhaps in your prescriptions for what to do about it, it seems to me that the sense of having a vision about the future of this country, when other countries are investing in high-speed rail for all kinds of reasons, but including rebalancing the economy, don't you accept that the fact that by 2024 that we should have a vision of this country with a stronger economic base outside the southeast, and that transport has a lot to do with that? I mean, as a regular traveller, I mean, by all means available, I would say it's not an easy task getting to the north of England. It's and high-speed rail, other countries, you know, are we to be the ones who are out of step with them? Even California, Dr. Wellings, I think, has been thinking about a high-speed train.
On the rebalancing issue, the problem is that better rail links don't really deal with the fundamental problems facing the north of England, which I would diagnose as being, in global terms, a very high-cost economy due to high levels of regulation and taxation, combined with a rather low, mediocre levels of human capital, skills, abilities, entrepreneurship and so on. And if you can look at the data on that, it varies from place to place. It's not too bad in Manchester, but it's very poor in places like Liverpool and Bradford and so on. And unfortunately, due to demographic changes, those problems are likely to get worse rather than better over the next 20 or 30 years. So unless you're going to deal with this fundamental cause of the North's poor performance, so high costs and mediocre human capital, which means it's very hard for the region to compete at a global level. I don't think you're going to get very far with something that's only going to increase transport capacity and door-to-door journey times quite marginally, and it's not really directed at the key problems. And there are numerous examples to show this. I mean, Doncaster's the classic. That has the best rail links to London in the north of England. Yet, if you take the town itself, it's one of the very poorest towns in the whole of the UK. So clearly, fast rail links haven't transformed Doncaster. HS2 hasn't transformed East Kent, another old industrial area, and Thanet and so on, which is still just about the poorest part of the southeast. So really, these issues are far more deep-seated, and they're not going to be cured by faster rail connections.
Can I again build on that? I think you have to. It's always lovely to have a vision thing, you know, and you can now brand it the Northern Powerhouse, whatever purple phrase you wish to have. But you have to try and disassemble that slightly. I mean, do we need sufficient capacity between our major cities? Absolutely. I haven't argued against that for 1 second. I've argued there are quicker, more incremental and cheaper ways of doing that. Do we need to have stronger northern economies? Absolutely. But then you have to get to the root of what is the problem that you're trying to solve there. Much of it is commuter capacity, not intercity capacity. Much of the deep-rooted problem and malaise in parts of the north, not all of the north by all means, is because the original rationale for why those cities grew where they did has gone. It could be coal, it could be steel, it could be shipbuilding, etc. Transatlantic trade in the case of Liverpool, cotton, wool in the case of Manchester and Leeds. And they're having to recreate their competitive advantage nationally. And that is quite a difficult thing for places to do. So one of the things we have got to invest in there, as I said earlier, is skills. We've actually got to create a new competitive advantage for those cities that gives them a self-sustaining momentum that is more than just a satellite of London, or indeed something, dare I say it, propped up by public sector spending. So you've got to actually create a new competitive advantage there. So for me, heavy investment in skills, actually bringing together, particularly in the north, and if we come on to the so-called HS2 in a minute, linking up the commuter lands of the north of England so that people can move to work on a commuter basis between some of our big northern cities, I think could be a significant advantage to those cities. But the idea that just having a vision thing and spending 50 billion will simply generate a revitalisation of the north that is sustaining and wealth creating, I'm afraid I do not agree with.
I don't think anybody's saying that, but anyway.
Some of the people who've given us evidence over the last few weeks have said that the October 2013 strategic case was an improvement on what went before. Do you agree with that, or do you think it does give a better narrative making the strategic case for HS2?
Well, I find it highly suspect how the case has changed over time. So originally, it started actually when the Conservatives first introduced the line. It was supposed to be an alternative to Heathrow expansion. It was actually rather reprehensible vote grabbing in southwest London. So they wanted to win half a dozen seats down there. They cancelled Heathrow expansion, and then they had to come up with an alternative to try and pretend it wouldn't harm the economy. So thus the high-speed line to the north was envisaged, I think it was back in 2009. It was only supposed to cost $20 billion back then. But then it became all about the time savings, then it was about capacity, and now it's all about rebalancing the economy and bridging the north-south divide, which I think just shows it is politically driven, and or if you like, PR driven. They have to, once the public becomes sceptical about the latest kind of rationale, and then this is then criticised heavily, then they have to come up with a new rationale for the project, which I think just makes the whole thing deeply suspect.
So HS2 has been described as a solution in search of the problem, and I have to agree that I can remember actually watching Theresa Villiers at the Conservative Party conference announcing high-speed rail to the north as the means by which we avoided the need for a third runway at Heathrow. And it's gone through, I think, more relaunches than the average soap opera's career, in terms of the way in which it's just transformed from solutions to the third runway, to all about speed. I remember sitting with Philip Hammond when he explained to me it was all about the journey time savings. 20 minutes to Birmingham would transform the economy in Birmingham. And that of course was debunked because that lost credibility very rapidly. Then it became all about capacity. Then we revealed just how low the capacity utilisation was on that line. And now it's all about creating the northern power hub. So it just keeps morphing from one rationale to another to another. And we've already covered just some of the underpinning flaws. That actually, the willingness to pay is simply the don't work on trains rebadged. The increase in the percentage of business travellers from 28 to 38%, again, has no underpinning statistically whatsoever. The wider economic impacts have been added in when they wouldn't be in most business cases. And the fact that the alternative that we put forward, was never properly compared against HS2. It was compared against completely illogical comparators in order to rubbish it completely fraudulently. And I think underpins the fact that this is not a business case that is actually made, in any rational sense whatsoever.
That's a pretty devastating critique. Thank you.
No, I like to tell it like it is.
Very useful.
Could we finally come to HS3? I think you both said that improved connectivity over relatively short distances actually can be demonstrated to be of benefit to the economy, although the Ashford to London link doesn't seem to have actually substantiated that point particularly well. But there's a strong case being made by the Northern Hub group that getting from Leeds, improved connectivity between Leeds and Manchester, two cities which have good skill bases and have significant and successful economic sectors, would actually be beneficial. Do you agree with that?
Well, I disagree with you that those cities are successful. I think it's almost all due to government spending.
I said they had some successful sectors.
But those are generally things like legal services that are dependent on state privileges and so on. I don't think they're successful in a genuine sense of, if you like, wealth creation on the market, but that's a sort of side issue perhaps. But I mean, looking at the sums of HS3, they're absolutely appalling. So you've got a very costly scheme that's likely to generate quite low passenger numbers compared with alternative schemes. So I suspect the BCR will be very low indeed. But the problem is it's completely wrong for the economic geography of the north of England, because generally professionals live in the outer suburbs or surrounding villages. So we're looking at, even with a half-an-hour journey from city centre to city centre, we're still looking at probably an hour and a half for a typical commuter coming from outside of Leeds, say, into the city centre, leaving some allowance to get the train, and then at the other end going from, say, Manchester, that hub in Manchester Piccadilly, to wherever they work in Manchester, which has a rather large city centre. So the door-to-door journey times, I think, will still be too great to achieve a lot of those agglomeration benefits and clustering benefits and so on. So I think in the north, really, because you have multi-nucleate cities, so Manchester actually made up of Stockport, Salford, Bolton, Oldham, Rochdale, etc. really there should be a bias towards trans-Pennine road schemes rather than rail, because that's the only way you're going to be able to have if you like, a net of connectivity between all these small towns. I think city centre to city centre rail is completely the wrong idea. It completely ignores the geography of the area.
I have a slightly different perspective to Dr Wellings again. For me, the jury's out, because I know virtually no details of the scheme. All I've seen is a political headline, and far be it from me as a politician to say that politicians make political headlines near elections. But it is clearly, it's a headline-grabbing announcement designed to get lots of publicity. I believe there is a rationale of actually extending the ability of people to commute for work between the major hubs, particularly Manchester and Leeds. I do not know any of the details of what HS2 would actually look like in terms of the number of stations, how people would get on and off it. If it is simply city centre to city centre, then it is pointless, because that is not where your skills catchment areas are. I mean, that's just self-evidently true. You need the ability for people to get on and off near where they live and commute to where they need to work. And if you could devise a scheme that does that, that's great. It needs to be cost-effective, and it needs to be, in the right place. And if one can devise a scheme that meets all those criteria, then I'm open to it. But I've not seen any numbers other than what's been in the headlines of the press.
Thank you very much. That brings this evidence session to an end. Thank you for your helpful, stimulating answers.